domestic workers could soon be able to claim compensation for injuries sustained at work. The National Assembly has adopted the Compensation of Injury on Duty Amendment Bill. Let's discuss this further with the Labour Federation's Matthew Parks. Mr. Parks, thank you for making time. This is welcomed news for domestic workers. How are they going to benefit?
Well, sure. Thank you very much. As Cosatu, we're quite pleased that this bill has been passed by the National Assembly. It must still go to the National Council of Provinces and then to the President to sign into law. But it's a very progressive law. It's been a long time in coming. Basically, it recognizes domestic workers' workplace, which is, people's houses, as the workplace under the Compensation of Injury on Duty Act. So if a domestic worker gets injured at a workplace, like any other worker who gets injured at their workplace, they will be entitled to relief from the compensation fund. So this is critical. We have about 800,000 domestic workers in South Africa, overwhelmingly women, largely African, largely coloured. It also recognises gardeners, for example. So this is going to provide relief to many of them. To date, they haven't been entitled to claim for injury on duty at the workplace. So this has been ruled unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court last year. So we're quite keen on it. It's going to provide relief to these hundreds of thousands of very poor workers. The remaining process is for the National Council of Provinces to pass it. We hope they can do so by the end of this year or early next year. It must then go to the President to sign it into law. Government then needs to implement it and so forth. So we think in the first half of next year it can come into effect. The one challenge, Clement, will be to make sure that these employers register the domestic workers under the Compensation of Injury on Duty Fund. That is going to be a significant challenge. Many domestic workers are not registered with the UIF, etc. So that we have to have a huge campaign as Cosatu, as the Department of Employment and Labour, to make sure all employers do register these domestic workers so they are protected under the law.
Oh, so does it mean the employers have to be the ones that register their domestic workers for them to be covered?
Yes, so the obligation is upon the employer to register domestic workers, to provide the salary details, the bank account details, the ID numbers, etc. of the domestic worker. So that's for the Compensation on Duty Fund. That's already provided for law under the Unemployment Insurance Fund. So that is a significant challenge. Okay. Domestic workers, you would know, are largely isolated. They work at one place by themselves, etc. So that's going to be a significant logistical feat, but it's something we have to do.
Yeah, so over 1 million domestic workers will be covered, Mr. Parks, and they were excluded in the first place. And I just wonder why that was the case, because that's unconstitutional. It's not progressive, as you said. They should also have enjoyed the rights to a safe working environment. Or is the issue here that most of them are working from one place to the other and are not normally registered?
Look, there are many gaps in our labour laws. I think we've seen it in the past year. There's significant gaps as the economy evolves, as the sectors change. Laws don't always keep up with those changes. So I think this is one of those instances. But look, it is also a clearly unconstitutional case. And that is why Cosatu's domestic worker affiliate union, Cosatu, took it to the Constitutional Court last year and won it. Unfortunately, they shouldn't have been forced to do so. Government should have amended these laws themselves proactively. This bill itself has taken quite a few years to get to Parliament. It left NEDLAC in 2018, and it took us, 3 years to get it to Parliament, to get it through the National Assembly. It must still go to the NCOP. So look, that is one issue. But I think, Clement, also the point you're raising, that the nature of domestic work has also changed significantly over the past 30 years. Previously, a domestic worker might only work for one family, Monday to Friday or weekends, etc. You now find domestic workers work for 2 or 3 families, 1 day here, 2 days here, another day there. So we need to make sure the systems of the Compensation Fund, the Unemployment Insurance Fund, etc., are sufficiently modernized, are agile to take into account those variations, and to make sure domestic workers are fully covered. But also we've seen, Clement, that under this pandemic, how critical it is to make sure the systems of these insurance funds of government for workers are modernized. There's been significant delays in getting relief to workers. You've also seen that it's not a small accident that you might need to cover for. You have a pandemic, COVID-19. COVID-19 gives relief, also the Compensation Fund gives relief to workers who are affected to COVID at the workplace. But again, domestic workers are left behind and they might very well be infected going to a workplace. So we have a huge need to kind of modernize these systems, make sure they're agile, make sure their IT systems, for example, are sufficiently capacitated so a domestic worker can go online, can use her cell phone to check, is she registered, how does she apply for assistance, etc. Is it also sufficiently accessible to the employer? Because many employers themselves have tried their level best to register workers, to claim for the workers, and have found a very archaic, unhelpful, unreliable system in government as well.
Yeah, yeah. And you've explained to us that the focus now shifts to the National Council of Provinces, and then we can possibly have this come into effect early next year. In terms of the minimum wage, Mr. Parks, when are domestic workers' salaries going to be increased to 100% of the national minimum wage? Because currently, as I understand it, they are seen as an exemption under the National Minimum Wage Act.
Sure. So as part of the National Minimum Wage Act, when it came into effect in the beginning of January 2019, was to peg farm workers at 90% and domestic workers at 75% of the minimum wage. That is to avoid job losses in what was seen as very vulnerable sectors of the workforce. Farm workers equalized to the minimum wage this year, so they're at 100%. Domestic workers, the gap was narrowed this year, so they're now at 88% of the minimum wage. And the recommendation from the Minimum Wage Commission, which is busy with it now, to the Minister of Employment and Labour is that domestic workers should equalize to the minimum wage from next year. We are pushing for, as Cosatu, that should be from the 1st of January next year. We are fairly confident that the Minister would agree to it. We cannot see any reason why they wouldn't. And there has been a broad understanding of the Minimum Wage Commission between Labour, business and government that indeed should happen. So we're hopeful that from 1st of January, domestic workers should equalize to the minimum wage. We're also hopeful that the minimum wage would be increased again to account for inflation, plus that inflation plus increase would also come into effect from 1st of January next year.
All right. Thank you so much for chatting to us. That was Labour Federation Cosatu's Matthew Parks.